Okay, I think we gave people a good amount of time. There's so much going on right now. I was trying to give people time to walk through this massive museum and find the auditorium, right? Welcome everyone. My name is Chastity Pratt Dawsey, and I'm a reporter for Bridge Magazine. We've heard of Bridge Magazine, right? Yes, keep me employed. Thank you. If you haven't, we are bridgemi.com, an investigative news source online, policy, government, all the good stuff. And today, I have with me people who, we've been through these sorts of panels so many times, haven't we? A very expert panel here to talk today about crisis or opportunity, what's going on in our schools, and what needs fixing, and how do we fix it. Who better to talk to than the folks we have here today with us? We have Amber Arellano, Executive Director of Ed Trust, an advocacy and research organization here in Michigan. Also with us, we have David Hecker, President of AFT Michigan. Alicia Merriweather, Deputy Superintendent of Detroit Public Schools Community District. I got to get used to saying that. And Sybil Wilson is the President of Michigan PTA. Yes. So before we get started, I want to go through a few fast facts. What do we want to talk about first? We want to talk about money, achievement, just throw something out here. This is going to be a back and forth discussion. Get used to it. Achievement. Michigan ranks 41st nationally on fourth grade reading proficiency. 41st. Just 29% of Michigan fourth graders are proficient readers. Raise your hand if you knew that already. Most people don't. That's 41st nationally. What else? Let's talk about money, per pupil spending. This fast fact from Bridge Magazine tells us that when it comes to per pupil spending, adjusted for inflation, it's down 7% between 2005 and 2014, ranking Michigan's growth in spending 49th amongst all states during that same period. Who knew? What else? Let's one more, just.
Where does that rank nationally?
49th.
No. Where does that rank nationally in spending per pupil?
Oh, and spending per pupil, let's go there. Spending per pupil. Where are we? There you go. Michigan ranks, no, that's teacher pay. Oh, as of 2014, Michigan spent $10,799 per pupil on K-12 public education, ranking 26th highest nationally. So middle of the pile. Middle of the pile in spending when it comes to growth and adding more money to the pile.
Bottom quarter in achievement.
Yepper. Worse than that, bottom 10 in achievement. Okay, so using that as our jumping off point, what I'm going to ask each of the panelists to do, we're just going to go straight down the line. Take a couple 3 minutes, and tell us what your expertise has taught you about what the top 3 challenges facing our schools are. Top 3 challenges. Each of you has a different title and a different stake in education, so it'd be interesting to see what each of you think is the top 3 challenges facing Michigan schools. Go first, Amber.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and really want to engage in a rich conversation this afternoon. As Chastity said, I'm the Executive Director of the Education Trust Midwest. So I run the Midwest division of a national research and policy and advocacy organization. And over the last 10 years, we've done a lot of research and a lot of learning about our challenges as a state, and also looking at what best practice looks like in leading education states around the country. And so after kind of really looking deeply for about 4 or 5 years at what leading states have been doing to become among the best states in the country for public education, it's also kind of helped us see the gaps in what we see are some of the great challenges that we have here in Michigan. So for us, 3 of those, I'll start from what I think from the top. And for someone who started her career, I started my career as a high school teacher, in fact, outside of Flint. So one is that when you look at the leading states in the country, they really give great thought and intentionality to the importance of the quality of instruction and teaching, and the quality of the teacher in the classroom. And I think for any of us, and I'm sure you have had those years when you experience the magic of a truly amazing teacher, right?
Mr. Stevens.
Mr. Stevens. Mine was Al Jewell in 6th grade. I love Al Jewell. Every year I tweet about Al Jewell when it comes to National, Teacher Appreciation Day. And you think about what kind of conditions teachers need to be really excellent in their practice, right? And I think no matter who, when we talk, I travel a lot for my job around Michigan, and when I talk with teachers and principals, there's so many challenges they have, right, to being great, and to being able to create that kind of magic in their classrooms every day. And I think so the great states in the country have been really intentional and thoughtful about trying to build systems from the ground up that support great teaching and great school leaders, right, and great principals, because we know those things for research are so important for student learning. Number 2, we talked a little bit about funding, but we are really behind in investment, and we're particularly behind in investment when it comes to equitable funding. We're now one of the worst states in the country when it comes to when we look at the gap between high poverty schools and the most affluent schools in the state. And that gap shows up in all kinds of ways, and this again affects the quality of the conditions for great teaching. I remember when I was coming out of Michigan State, and there were recruiters from all over the state there recruiting the best talent, right, in the teaching school, and there were districts like Bloomfield Hills that would say, I'd love to hire you, kid, but you need a little bit of more experience. Go teach in Flint for a couple years, and then let's talk, and then I can pay you $25,000 more, right, than what Flint's going to be able to pay you. So, the higher poverty and working class school districts would be, I taught with many novice teachers in the school that I taught, and I didn't really know what I was doing in the beginning, like many people in a new profession, right? It takes time to learn the practice and the profession. And then when we got a little less green and we knew what we were doing, we started getting plucked out of that school and recruited for higher teaching salaries in other districts. So those kinds of gaps that drive the differences, right, in the conditions that make it difficult for districts in, say, Detroit or my hometown in Pontiac, makes it difficult for those places to attract talent and to keep investing in talent. And number 3, I want to talk about, when we talk about equity, there are other things that are really drive differences in the kind of conditions that we in Michigan compared between districts, but also compared to other states, and I'd say leadership. We've had a huge leadership gap at the state level for well over a decade, and it just, frankly, I think it just hasn't been a priority. It has not been a top priority for many, many years, and it's been true, across partisan politics. I mean, there's been a leadership gap across both parties, and so one of my hopes is that whoever the next governor is, that person will make public education a top priority and follow evidence-based practices and investment. Education has become such an ideological football between both political parties, and both the far left and the far right can be guilty of this, about trying to push practices and investments that are not necessarily supported by what research and evidence tells us help kids learn. So
leadership on the state level, meaning legislature, government, the governor, and that level.
And the
Gotcha.
state superintendent, yeah. Those are my three.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
Quality teachers, funding equity, leadership gap. What say you, David Hecker of the Michigan AFT?
I think Amber was looking at my notes.
Cheater.
AFT, for people who don't know, American Federation of Teachers Michigan, is the state federation of the National Union, the American Federation of Teachers. So we represent pre-K 16 educators, teachers, support staff throughout the state of Michigan. And picking three is hard. I just had an article.
Just three, David. Just three.
In the Michigan Association of School Boards magazine, in which I listed 8. But I'll go down to 3, just for you, Chastity. I'll go down to 3. Okay, and something's going to be repetitive, and I apologize for that. Funding. Funding's inadequate. Chastity said how much we've declined. That has tremendous impacts on big class sizes, programmatic cuts, retaining and attracting the best and the brightest. As Amber said, we absolutely need to teach our kids. As Amber said, funding is not equitable. We don't want equal funding. We want equitable funding, because it takes more money to educate kids in some districts than it takes in others. A second thing is we have to recognize, and this gets to the equitable, not equal thing, that poverty matters.
We understand what he means by equity as opposed to equal. So if it takes $10,000 to educate Chastity because she has some gaps, she doesn't know how to read that well, whereas David is a really good reader and, doesn't come from an impoverished home, and maybe it only takes $8,000 for him to get to the same standard, right? That's equity.
Right.
Giving kids what they need based upon their needs.
Right.
Gotcha.
So the second thing, and it is sort of related to equitable, not equal, is that poverty matters. Kids from low-income communities are as smart as kids from the community that we're in now. But there's no question that poverty places obstacles before many, many kids in low-income communities, preventing them from reaching their academic potential. And we have to recognize that, and we have to deal with that. We have to deal with that by having integrated student supports or wraparound services in every single school district, but that's really a Band-Aid, right? That's a Band-Aid. What we really need to do is to have an economy which we don't have poverty. We need to do things like a $15 minimum wage to try to lift people out of poverty and other things. So poverty matters, and we have to address that. The third thing, which Amber mentioned in her own words, is we have to trust and empower educators. The quality of the teacher in the classroom is the absolute key. Everybody else, if it's an incredibly great deputy superintendent or if it's a maintenance worker in a school, they all support what is going on with the teacher in the classroom. I'll differ with Amber on one thing. It really hasn't been a bipartisan issue. One political party supports teachers in public education and the other one doesn't. And in the last 8 years, there have been massive attacks by elected officials of a certain political party.
Hey, no secrets here. What are you talking about?
Undercutting teacher rights, undercutting teacher voice, undercutting teacher tenure.
So our legislature is controlled by the Republican Party and has been so for a few terms. Are you referring to the Republican Party doing what? What have they done? Be specific.
Party,
go ahead.
Which has controlled Lansing for 8 years, not properly funding, far too much standardized testing, taking away from teachers the right to bargain certain issues like discipline and discharge and evaluation, totally undermining tenure, totally undermining the unions through different things that these teachers and support staff have democratically elected. So we have to trust and empower educators. And we also have to pay them what they deserve, so we can pay working conditions so we could retain and attract the best and the brightest.
Okay, so we have some of the same issues coming up, which is helpful for our very short discussion. Alicia Merriweather, Deputy Superintendent of the state's largest school district. What say you?
So some of my comments, I think, are going to be repetitive.
That's fine.
To what's already been said, but I'll try and boil it down to three.
Mm-hmm.
I think, first of all, when you understand how education actually works, it's the dynamic between the student, the teacher, and curriculum, right? So there's a lot of research out there around making learning visible, and when you look at how the student, the teacher, and the curriculum interact, that's the true definition of an education. And so if you take each of those pieces and drill down into investment, so thinking about how we invest in teachers, so that includes teacher training, that includes how we pay teachers and how we respect teachers, which are not the same thing, although they should be connected, in that we say we respect education, we say that teaching is one of the most amazing careers, and it is. As a former middle school teacher, I will say there's nothing like being able to influence the trajectory of a child's life. There's nothing else you can get paid or not paid to do that is equivalent to that. And having young people that come back when they're adults and say, thank you, because you literally saved my life. There's no money you can put on that. That being said, teachers should be paid an adequate wage and should be surrounded with support and professional development and things that help them to be better as instructors. Students, what investment are we making in the actual student? And that's where this idea of equitable funding comes in. When you have students who are in poverty and also experiencing trauma-related environments, there are different supports that are needed in order to educate that particular population appropriately. And so thinking about what we do in schools and how we fund support that actually is for the teacher and the student is something that has to be considered. And then finally, the curriculum. Obviously, we have some national standards out there, and we have our state standards. And then you have your local districts that get to make choices. And so thinking about what we know after all the research that's been done around curriculum that actually helps students learn, and when we think about what's being required around testing, testing does not help students learn. When you test and test and test and you find out students are at a certain level and you don't intervene between the tests, I don't know why we're surprised that there hasn't been much advancement. So we need to think about how we're using testing in the curriculum and how the curriculum is used to incorporate differentiated instruction, so meeting students where they are. And so when you think about students, teachers, and curriculum, and really that goes back to policy. What policies do we have in our state about how those things are funded? And it also goes back to when you think about, look, very, very specifically, let's drill down into equitable funding. So there's policies in place around students and teachers and curriculum, and there's funding decisions that are made every day, but yearly when there are votes and different legislation goes up to vote, thinking about what are we really saying here about how we value education across all districts and how we value education in this state. That's a policy backed by or not backed by funding. Unfunded mandates also are part of policy that create challenges. So if I had to group them just to three recap, looking at how students, teachers, and curriculum interact, policies that are made aside of funding, and then very specifically around equitable funding and making sure that we give districts and students and teachers exactly what they need to support students' learning.
Well, I don't have to recap because Teacher Merriweather did that. Thank you. So, Sybil, parents, from a parent's point of view, from Michigan PTA, from all of the conferences and discussions and volunteer efforts you are involved in, what are you hearing from the very involved parent contingent as to what the three top challenges are for our schools?
Well, thank you, Chastity. I just want to give just a bit of background for those who may not be familiar. I represent Michigan Parent Teacher Association, otherwise known as PTA. We are the oldest child advocacy association worldwide. PTA has over 121 years of advocacy, and in Michigan, we have just celebrated 100 years this year. And you will not find a more committed association to fighting for what we feel is equitable, fair, and just for our children. And with that in mind, the three things, and you may be surprised as a parent when I say this, I'm right in line with everything that everyone has said. Funding, student focus, and the T in PTA, which is teachers. The unfunded mandates in Michigan have got to stop. We've got to return to what the Constitution calls for, which is to focus on public education and not siphon off funds for, no offense, community colleges and higher education, but focus on that K through 12 learning, which is where originally the funding was supposed to go. To not support any kind of vouchers or anything that would siphon off funding that was designated for public schools. And even things that happen in legislation that we don't know about. For instance, some of the tax things that are coming up right now may be shifted by leaders to other areas when they're supposed to go to education. So we have to be very vigilant in watching what our legislators and our leaders are doing with the funding when it calls to be going to education and they siphon it off to other areas. For students, we must invest in education in art, language, music programs, early childhood programs, career and college readiness, skills, special education. All students, fully funded regardless of zip code. It should not matter where you live to get these services. High quality, benchmark, consistent state curriculum standards. It is unconscionable that there is not a standard that we can all agree upon as far as producing the next level of leaders. Health and wellness programs designed for the whole child, including mental health. And finally, for teachers, Michigan legislators and decision makers that listen to what teachers are saying and support educators working together to build a stronger education system here in Michigan. An implementation of a pay and benefit structure that encourages educators to remain in the profession. My mother served in the Detroit Public Schools for more than 40 years, and you could not pay me to be a teacher because I didn't have the temperament for what I would probably get paid. You have to have people who are dedicated to the service of our children, and if you're dedicated to this work, which is the foundation for everything else, your doctors came through K through 12 education, your lawyers, your mechanics, the people that you trust with everything came through this level of education, but we would rather pay people in other professions 3 and 4 times the level that we pay the people who are laying foundations and are caring for our most precious resources. Let's think about that and how backward that is. The paradigm must shift if we're going to get qualified people with a passion for teaching to follow that profession. We have to make it worth their while. So, as a recap, funding, student focus, and to support our teachers, that TNPTA. And of course, if those things happen, parents are going to be very, very happy. And we're going to be partners in that.
All righty. Well, so from what I can tell, we have researcher, teacher, DPS, superintendent, and parent all agreeing that we're looking at equity issues in funding. We're looking at issues with curriculum and teacher training. So we're going to drill down on a couple of those while we in the time that we have. And I'm going to start this part of conversation off with one of my favorite topics, which is the state of Massachusetts. I went there and studied what they're doing because they, 20 years or so ago, were in the middle of the pack nationally, right along with Michigan. And now they are the country's gold standard for school reform. If they were their own country, their students probably would be in the top 10 in the world as far as some measures, especially with like math. The gains that you've seen in Massachusetts are the reason why we have the Common Core standards now. Am I lying? No. No, that's what's going on. And 20 years ago, Michigan was right neck and neck with them, but they've leapfrogged over us and everyone else because of the changes that they made in funding, the way they fund their schools, and rigor, what they teach in class, and training, how they train their teachers. And so let's talk about rigor here in Michigan, or let's talk about third grade reading. How about that? Third grade reading, as we all know, is the indicator, is a key indicator about that tells us whether students are going to do well educationally in their future. Once you're reading well in third grade, then you can start to learn other topics. Read to learn science, read to learn social studies, read to learn math. But if you're not reading by third grade, then you're going to have trouble moving forward. And as we know here in Michigan, we're not doing too well. So Amber, could you talk briefly about the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to our third grade reading indicators and what policies are in play around that?
Yeah. So this is such a high-stakes topic right now. So many of you know that the Michigan legislature passed a law about 2 years ago that is similar to what some other states have done, called the third grade reading guarantee. And it's supposed to create more urgency and focus for schools to improve third grade reading levels by a certain date, especially next school year, because the law also requires for students to potentially be held back or retained if they are not proficient in third grade reading by the next school year. My daughter, in fact, is one of the first classes or the cohorts in the state of Michigan to be potentially held back if she's not reading on grade level. So I think about it.
Is that 2 years from now? Or
that's
next
not this school year, but the following school year.
Next school year, if your kid's not reading well on third grade standard, that child can be held back.
Potentially held back, depending on how that law is implemented.
How many kids are on track, or what's our third grade reading level now?
So, but based on the most recent data we can look at, there could be tens of thousands of students held back in the state, the majority of kids in the state. Again, we don't know that though because it's really unclear on how this could be implemented. I think you know, the lawmakers that passed the law were in part inspired by the work of the state in Florida that did that actually did a lot of great work around raising early literacy rates. Using under Governor Jeb Bush, there was a retention law that was passed, and there was great urgency. That law did create great urgency at the state and regional and local levels to improve third grade outcomes. And there was literally tens of millions of dollars invested in ensuring that all K-12, all teachers in the state of Florida were retrained on the very best practices that research tells us on how kids learn how to read best. And that might sound like, why is that important? But in fact, over the last 10 to 15 years, we've learned a lot as a society about how kids learn how to read. What we know now about how kids learn how to read is very different, say, than what we knew in terms of a society 10 and 15 years ago. So in Florida, state leaders said, let's use this law to really generate urgency and focus, but also let's put into place a really robust new approach to retraining all of our teachers and giving them ongoing support and all kinds of other things that we don't have to time to get into here today about how they implemented. I think this is a great example of some lawmakers were, I think, well-intentioned when they passed the law, thinking that if they passed a law, they could just sort of legislate systemic change.
Right.
Right? And that was just sort of going to magically happen.
But if the scores continue on the trend line that they are, this year's reading scores got no better and in some places got worse. If the trend line continues, then tens of thousands of third graders, yes, in your school district as well, could be left behind.
Yeah, and I think what's so troubling about it is
repeat
that...
the third grade.
Right. That's so troubling about it is that so much of the work in terms of building better systems, right, and supporting teachers and capacity building and, everything from investment in more time for kids who are really, really behind in reading over summers and, work around curriculum. I mean, there's a million things we could talk about that should have and could have been done, but really are not been done. And when they've been done, they don't think they're being done well in many cases. And educators, again, especially in high poverty schools, districts that we have talked to have expressed concern and frustration about this kind of implementation.
Well, we happen to have some of them at the table. Let's talk about it.
Right. So with I think that the accountability for reading well is now on the kids and not necessarily on other parts of the system, including the state leaders that passed the law, right? There's no accountability for the state and doing the work better or investing better and moving those outcomes. But really now the accountability is on the kids, because if you're held back as a kid, there's a lot of research that shows that that kids' confidence can be really hurt. There can be a stigma, and they can actually be less likely to graduate from high school if they're held back.
Right.
So it's a great case study of the challenges that we have in Michigan in terms of improving outcomes for kids.
If you could talk about, we're still on the topic of third grade reading, what are teachers needing in order to help move the needle, or is this a wrong-headed policy, the idea of holding back third graders?
Well, it's a totally wrong-headed policy, completely wrong-headed policy that I think for too many legislators was all about getting a good sound bite that I'm doing something rather than doing something that actually works. Amber mentioned the imperative need to use evidence-based strategies to help our kids learn. Absolutely. So if legislators wanted to do something about the third grade reading issue, which the proficiency rates are horrible, much has to done. Let's fund universal quality early childhood education. Let's fund interventions for our kids who show in grades earlier than third grade that this is going to be a problem for them. Let's do what Amber said Florida does, and totally, provide the kind of professional development so that every teacher, not just reading specialists, but that every teacher is up to speed on what needs to be done to help teach a child to read. We held back our now 23-year-old son when he was in second grade, but that was a decision between myself, my wife, and his teacher, and we sat down together and decided together what we thought was best for Gustavo. And it wasn't a result of Gustavo's grade on a standardized test not meeting a certain level, so you're automatically held back. So let's do what's needed to help all our kids learn to read at the level they should be reading at. Let's not just punish the kids who don't get there.
I'm gonna circle back around to you, Alicia, because I want you to pivot on a different topic. But Sybil, if you could, one thing I'm always amazed at is in these conversations or in response to an article, how few people are aware of these hugely impactful policies that are in place. And I would like for you to help me understand, are parents really aware of our low achievement level here in Michigan? What do we need to do to spread the word or to, really get people to understand just how dire the situation is?
No, parents are not aware. Why aren't parents aware? Let's think about this just briefly. Mm-hmm. In your mind, think about your relationship to school when you were a child. That colors how you relate to school when you're an adult. So So while we're saying parents should be more engaged, they should come into the school, they're not paying attention to what we send home. Most times what's not being taken into consideration is, was this parent in special ed? Was this parent afraid? How was this parent's discipline? So is the school for them an albatross, or is it, like it was for me, an oasis? So parents are afraid. Then when they get there, we start throwing acronyms at them. IEPs, 504s, CCRIs, and all this kind of stuff. It's intimidating. So now you're telling me in so many words, my child may not go to 4th grade. I don't even understand what you're saying, because a lot of times I haven't been able to track what's going on, or I'm not educated enough to find out what legislation is going on, and some parents aren't even really making the connection between what's happening in the legislature and what's in the school. Now, I can speak for our partners in Detroit Public Schools Community District. They took the time and called parents in and said, we want to show you what is going to happen. This is what is on the horizon. This is what the district is looking at. We don't necessarily, at that time, they didn't have a plan, but they called the parents in.
Right.
But you have to create a welcoming environment. And then,
But I'm not even talking about those parents. I'm talking about Troy, Ann Arbor,
Oh, no.
Rochester. I
No,
mean,
because
there are a
that
lot of
doesn't-
parents in
that doesn't
these
affect
middle-income
us.
areas who think their schools are fine. It's Detroit that's failing.
because that doesn't affect us the same way. And the question is, are the same conversations being held? Are the same conversations being held, or is there, social promotion that's just been going on, where they weren't identifying the issues and weren't making full disclosure of what issues they were finding, but because this person is a major contributor, or they might be high profile, I can't imagine what conversation was held with you to have your child held back. I mean, that had to be incredibly hard. And are you going to do that with someone who is affluent, who may have just purchased, the whole uniform for the football team? Are you really going to have that conversation? So, in those areas, what's the accountability going to be for that? And what is the message that's being put out?
Dovetailing off of that, Amber, real quick, I need just a stat from you. When we look at Michigan and we take out children of color and we take out low-income students, how are our average income kids of color, in other words, our average income white students, doing compared to the rest of the nation?
Yeah, so we, as Chastity spoke to earlier, Michigan, Massachusetts were really kind of neck and neck among the leading states in the country more than 25 years ago. And now we're in the bottom 10 states in the country, even for higher income students. And as a parent, I want to speak to what Sybil was saying. So I live in Oakland County. I live just south of here. And I wouldn't know anything about the 3rd grade reading. Right, I wouldn't know that my daughter is at risk to be retained next year unless it was for my job. We've not had one conversation in our school district, right? There's been no town hall, there's been no discussion. And so there's a pretty significant information gap. And it's not just about the details and the challenges at the policy level, which are many, but it's even in terms of just the day-to-day life for parents, right? That we don't really know
Right.
what's going on. And I have somebody who works in Lansing who tells me what's going on, but most parents don't have that. I just want to mention that for those of you who are interested, we have a weekly newsletter that tries to address this information gap. We have cards out on tables here following the conversation here. If you want to sign up for our weekly newsletter, we hope that you do. You'll get action alerts, but you'll also just get a sort of a weekly summary of kind of big key issues that are going on in the state, at the state level. You can also text Top 10 to 345-345. That's Top 10 to 345-345, and we'll put you on our mailing list.
Gotcha. Real quickly, I want Alicia to address something, and then we'll take a couple questions. I think I would be remiss if we didn't bring up water. Could you give us an update on what's happening with the water in Detroit, and even probably more to the point, what that may say about water in schools across the state?
Right, it's a really important topic. And first of all, it should be very, very clear that there is currently no policy that requires schools to test water. So for such an important topic, there is currently no law that requires schools to test their water. And so that is one thing when we talk about the disconnect between policy and the weeds that people go into around policy, and there's this big gaping issue around health that has not yet become policy. And so I want to say that first. As far as the water in Detroit Public Schools Community District, our superintendent took a very proactive stance to test all water sources in all of our schools. And so why that's significant is we had tested water before in about 2016, and that made headlines then, and we closed off the water in those particular schools at that time. But when Dr. Vitti came last year and he saw those results, he started asking some more questions and said, you know, looking at the results, it looks like only a few random samples were taken at the schools that were tested, and that was true. And he pushed and said, that's not enough. We need to test all of the water in all of our schools. And so he required that to happen. And so when the first set of results came back in May, June, we found, bless you, we found that there were several schools that had exceedances of lead and copper. And so at that moment, those schools were shut off and water coolers were supplied. So at no time were students in DPSCD without water. So I also think that's very important to note. Students were provided with clean water through Absopure coolers on a daily basis. So as soon as the water was shut off, an alternate water supply was provided. And so then the next set of results comes in. And as the results came in, statistically, you start noticing that it's about 66% of the results coming in that are showing an issue. And I remember the cabinet meeting that was called to discuss what had been found. This was right before school started, and we had an honest conversation. And at the end of the day, Dr. Vitti said, I have to shut off all of the water because statistically it's trending towards a big problem. And at the end of the day, you can sleep at night knowing that you gave water to kids that didn't need it. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, if we paid extra money to provide clean water when it was not necessary, everyone who was a part of that decision can sleep well at night. If you had a sense that we're statistically headed in a very dangerous way, and you say, you know what, we're just going to keep the water on, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And I think, we need to, people point to Flint and they point to other places, but at the end of the day, when it's right in front of you, you have to think for yourself what is right for kids. And the decision to cut off all of the water in the district was the right decision. I think at that point, the results keep coming in and it's still trending in that way. 66% of the results coming back are showing an issue. And so right now we have water coolers at every single school. The water fountains are turned off, and we are moving towards a permanent solution. And so we've consulted with a team in Flint and other national experts. Those of you who have followed the news, you have seen school districts like Baltimore and Portland, Oregon have actually turned off their water several years ago.
Yes, for
so
years.
This is actually not a unique issue.
Right.
What's interesting in the Detroit context is that while all of the focus has been on DPSCD, the larger question should really be for everyone, everywhere, what are the water results in your school? And if no one can answer that question, you need to keep asking that question to your boards, to your superintendents, and to your local PTA and other organizations. Just think about what I'm saying. If you don't know the answer to that question, you need to be asking that question. And I give a lot of kudos to our Board of Education and to our superintendent for pushing through, asking the question, and not stopping until we get an answer. And so we've held community meetings. We're moving towards a permanent solution,
Right.
which is going to
could
be
the
hydration stations.
Hydration stations. So we are running out of time. I just want to say really quickly, in Bridge, I did a story a couple weeks ago off of the water thing, and the whole topic was, does your school have tainted water? Chances are you don't know, because there's no federal or local EPA or otherwise guidelines that require the water to be tested. And so in Detroit Public Schools, there were older buildings and there were brand-new buildings that were all coming up with these issues. And if you live in this Tri-County area, you're getting the same water that they are. So, yeah. I'm going to take a couple questions. We are like 2 minutes before the time limit, but you have a question?
I do. The issue with the water is not in the water supply in these cases. It's with the fixtures in the buildings. And that if you have fixtures more than about 5 years old, there can be lead-based solder in those fixtures. And that applies to everyone in every home and every office building and every other place.
I wish we knew that to be the fact.
And it's not just old buildings.
I wish we knew that to be true. That's something that's still being investigated. So, any other questions?
We definitely know the water supply is clean when it's leaving the water plant, the Great Lakes Water Authority.
Not sure we know that's true either. Go ahead.
Everybody familiar with the term impact investing? Impact investing, I would refer you to Steve Case's book, The Third Wave, 3 chapters about impact investing. I can tell you that every business leader in this country is just as concerned about education as anybody here. They will tell you all the time, we can't find people to do our work. They're ready to try to cut the money. And I agree with that idea, but certainly one of the others is passing that around because this is a very rich country. We can afford to do what we need to do.
So the ed reform that happened in Massachusetts was led by the business community. The Business Alliance for Educational Options, I think it was the name of it. They basically led the reform movement in Michigan, in Massachusetts, because they felt like they weren't getting the outcomes from the public schools that they needed in order to grow their economy. So there's definitely truth in that. So we have basically run out of time. I'm going to sum up a couple things for you. Raise your hand if you believe that your schools in Michigan are on the right track. Good luck with that.
Good luck with it.
Good luck with that. We are still in the bottom 10, and we are still quibbling and lancing over how to fix that. Raise your hand if you believe that schools in Detroit deserve as much or equitable funding as schools in higher funded districts. But that has never happened in the 200-year history of our state. We have a long way to go, and we didn't even have time to talk about Launch Michigan, which is a statewide effort to solve some of these funding issues. I would challenge you to look up Launch Michigan online and get involved and get informed on what Launch Michigan is doing to try and bring equitable funding to our schools. And fund my schools. Again, I want to thank Amber, David, Alicia, Sybil. Really good conversation, and thank you for coming.